Breakthrough.
You're watching Breakthrough News.
Through News, and this is the Freedom Side Live. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Perrier, here as always alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Good to be back on with you, Eugene.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that. And we are very happy to be here with all of our viewers. Jesus Christ, that's a rough start. Viewers, not listeners, although I don't know, maybe you're cooking or doing something else and listening. So however you're engaging with the content, we're happy to have you. And as we start here today, of course, we just want to remind you, as we always do, for those of you watching on YouTube, make sure that you hit the subscribe button so you can subscribe to all the great content we have coming out. Make sure you also hit the bell so that way you get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to. So that way you can follow all of the great stuff coming from Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek, among many other fantastic offerings that we are bringing you. And of course, also a time to remind you that however you choose to do so, please alert anyone you know that this show is live, that it's happening, that we've got a great show, that we're going all around the world, from Greece to Africa to Palestine to right here in the United States of America, and maybe a few other places too before we are done. So I know last week, Rania, you did not like when I advised people to put out an air horn in their window and just do a general alert. So if you don't want to, so however, you use an air horn, yell out the window, send a text message, tweet about it, put it on Instagram. I'm not on Instagram. I don't know how you do that, but I'm sure you can find a way to do it if you're on there.
Yeah, Eugene, you gotta get on Instagram. Like, what are you doing?
It's not going to happen. I'm not on Instagram or TikTok, and it will not happen. Unless Instagram, if you're out there, if you want to pay me, then we could talk about that. Product placements, I can think about that. But it's like college sports now, with what do they call them? The they can pay the players. It's like what, NIL, PIL. Someone will correct me in the chat, but either way, I'm seeing all sorts of people get these endorsements. So I'm willing to engage in a similar type of deal.
How about, I have a better idea. How about if we can get like 100 new patrons, Eugene will join Instagram. That seems like a fair deal to me, right?
If we can get 100 new patrons, but in how much time?
Why do you gotta add conditions? Okay, in 1 month. If the next month we get 100 new patrons, Eugene Perrier is agreeing on air, like you cannot take it back. This is a verbal contract.
Yes,
okay?
It's binding.
To join Instagram. Yeah, it's binding.
Well,
and how can people join? Wait, so for those who do want to see Eugene on Instagram, you can become a patron at patreon.com/breakthrough news. I highly encourage our viewers and listeners to immediately go onto the Patreon website at this website you see at the bottom of the screen. Become a patron. Starting now, we have a month from now to get Eugene on Instagram. It's a new campaign.
I'm honestly going to be a little concerned if there's that many people who want me on Instagram. That's kind of why I'm not on there already, but I'm with it. I've agreed to it. 100 patrons in 1 month. February 19th. If we've reached 100 new patrons, I will indeed get on Instagram. Now, doesn't necessarily mean I'll post, but I will be on.
Okay, but you'll be there. And then once you're on there, then we can do some campaigns to force you to post. Because shaming you and bullying you has not worked up until now. So
well, listen, what can I say? I have a strong constitution. But
also I should remind our viewers that if you don't care about Eugene on Instagram and aren't ready to become a patron, or say, you know what, let's say you are a patron or about to become one, you can also support our excellent work here at Breakthrough News with our big and growing team by donating on YouTube directly. There's a fundraising option there. Yes.
Thank you for that. Well, Rania, with all of the business aside, if you will, we want to turn to our first story here, which I certainly wish more people knew about, and that is an ongoing trial against a couple dozen individuals who were working to help refugees trying to get into the European Union. And we are very honored to be joined as we continue this conversation by one of those defendants, Mr. Peter Wittenberg. Mr. Wittenberg, thank you so much for being with us.
Good night. Thank you for having me on the show.
Well, we're really honored to have you here, and I think this is a story that maybe many of our listeners maybe have not heard a lot about, and they just heard maybe the broad outlines. But if you could maybe to start, just give us a capsule view of why you and others are on trial for trying to help refugees and what they are trying to charge you with.
We are on trial because we saved lives. And that's the answer.
Yeah.
Maybe the Greek government doesn't like us. Maybe the European Union is opposing more refugees. But this is a fact. We only were saving lives. And that's it. And the prosecutor thinks that saving lives is the same as espionage, human trafficking, putting up a criminal organization, being member of the criminal organization as well, money laundering, and so on and so on.
Can you walk us through like what exactly are the charges here, and what precedent, if this actually goes through, if this prosecution is successful, what precedent does it set for future attempts at life-saving measures for refugees?
Well, the charges are espionage, money laundering, being a member a member of a criminal organization, put up a criminal organization as well, and what else? Money laundering. So the problem is that here laws that are in our rules and are normal are misused for a goal that we fear is to get NGOs that try to save lives and people that want to help to intimidate them and tell them don't do it, because there are 24 at this moment 24 risking a punishment of 24 years.
I was hoping you could, for our listeners, sort of walk through, how dangerous it is for refugees crossing into the European Union. I mean, you all are out there assisting them, but it's not as if, they just need a little bit of assistance. This is a really harrowing process, it seems.
Yes, it is, Eugene. It's a journey of only about 10 nautical miles from Turkey to one of the Greek islands. But they do this in a dinghy, in a rubber boat. And there are about 40 to 60 people in one boat, which is not designed in itself to be at sea. So when it is 10 meters from the shore, it's unseaworthy in itself. It's floppy, it's terrible. These people are in this boat and they have no experience whatsoever for being at sea. And they have to steer it and to run the outboarder in darkness, in the waves, and any wave that hit that boat brings water into the boat. So it's sinking from the first moment. These people are scared to death.
No, please continue.
Go on, please.
No. Please continue what you were saying.
Okay. These people are scared to death, and they don't know where to go. They're unexperienced, and they're crossing a shipping lane as well. We never heard about accidents with the ships in the shipping lane, because a big ship will not know that it hit a dinghy. So we can only see the corpses, and we don't know what happened. These people are trying to reach Europe, and they are looking for refuge. And the Coast Guard is not helping. The Greek Coast Guard is not helping. The Navy that's outside is not helping. They are trying to avoid any landings. There's no one that cares for them. Only the NGOs, and they do what the governments doesn't do. They don't do, because these governments have signed many international agreements, like the Universal Declaration of the Rights of Man, 1984, 88. No, sorry, 1948. Sorry, Mrs. Roosevelt did. Nobody's helping them. So as long as the governments don't do what they are supposed to do, it are the volunteers and the NGOs that try to save their lives. And now we are in the courthouse, intimidated. That means that other NGOs and other volunteers are scared to go and help them. There's no one in the beach anymore. So the refugees are paying the bill. It's not us, it are the refugees. They're paying the bill.
So it seems clear here that part of this is to deter humanitarian efforts from, as you're saying, I mean, saving people who otherwise, I mean, the government's not doing anything to save them. The Navy's not doing anything to save them. And it reminds me of this policy that we have in the United States at the border, which is called, you know, it's not called this officially, but others have called it death by deterrence. Or deterrence by death. And so the idea is you want to maximize the dangers and the deaths of the route of refugees, right? So that others who are considering making the journey will hesitate and perhaps not make it in order to decrease the number of refugees. So is that what you think is happening here as well? I mean, on top of, is that the ultimate goal, do you think, of trying to deter humanitarians from helping save lives, is to have that sort of, you know, deterrence by death policy in place? In other words, maximizing the number of people who are harmed or die on their way to try to get to Europe.
Yes, I agree. I completely agree. This is the ultimate goal of the European Union and the governments of Greece, Italy, Spain, France. And this is so dangerous because it's a poison. It really is a poison. And it's spreading in an unprecedented way because nobody knows what happens there. There are no journalists anymore. So there are pushbacks. I guess this is a pushback. Yes. It's terrible. They are pushed back, and we call it in Europe, we call it illegal pushbacks. But every pushback is illegal.
You know, one thing I'm curious is, what led you to become involved in these efforts?
Yeah. First of all, because it has to be done. Excuse me. It has to be done, and I have the time for it, and I have all certificates to run a boat and to operate the radio on a boat. So I felt I had to do something. There's something else. My father flew out of Czechoslovakia 1939, just before Hitler marched in. He's a Jew, and he came to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam were nice people that helped him and guided him through the war during 5 years. That's the only reason I was born in Amsterdam. And I was as lucky to be born there. And until now, there's no need to run away from Holland.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought I had to pay the bill for my father and pay back what people did to him, to other people.
You know, I also am curious if there's been a backlash. What has been the reaction in the public, at least in in Greece or even in the EU? Has there been pushback against this? Is any of that pushback coming from any governments, or is this something that the entire European Union is sort of on board with and supporting?
I guess the European Union is supporting it, but not saying it out loud. They're paying for it. They know about it. There was an investigation by the European Union that the body police of the European Union, Frontex, was watching by when the Greek Coast Guard were doing pushbacks, and they didn't report it. So yes, it is hidden, but it's on purpose, and nobody cares about lives. The only thing the European Union is caring is not to get that much and that many refugees. It's hard to say, very cruel, but this is my conclusion.
Well, let me ask you this. For those who are watching who are wondering if there's a way to support you all on trial or just the overall efforts, is there anywhere you would direct them?
I could direct them to, let's see, Free Humanitarians. You can find it on the internet and on Facebook as well.
Well,
you can
Mr.
follow
Wittenberg,
that.
we really appreciate you being willing to join us here on the Freedom side, and certainly we'll continue to track this story the best we can. And thanks again for staying up late for us.
Thank you. Hope to see you in better times.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What a ridiculous story. But, it does remind me again of we have seen this at the U.S.-Mexico border as well, where there's, I think leaving water.
Yeah, cutting the water, destroying the water.
Yeah, well, they destroy the water, but there's other things that have been criminalized, like leaving life-saving aid, basically, in certain parts of the desert.
Yes.
There's been people prosecuted for that. I don't think any of that's actually gone through, but the point is this: it's clearly a strategy being used by global North countries across both sides of the Atlantic, and it's really disgusting and shameful.
Yeah, no, totally. No More Deaths is a great group in the Southwest. It's put out a lot of reports on the same issue for the U.S. border. And I think you're 100% right, Rania. I mean, it's sort of like these countries in a way cause all the problems by these economic policies, these wars, all, climate change, which they're not taking responsibility for. And then they say, even though your world is destroyed, you can only come to our world under very, very, slender circumstances, if that. And most of it is all just about making people cheap laborers. I mean, Australia, similar thing. There's an interesting story in Al Jazeera today about this exact issue about Australia's, they call it a point-based immigration system, but more or less how it's a brain drain happening on the Pacific Islands. Canada, same thing. They have a similar quote-unquote point-based system. So yeah, anywhere that has a lot of wealth seems is doing their absolute utmost in order to, prevent people from just it sounds so crazy to say, Rania, when you think about it, like, oh yeah, people just want to live decent lives and take care of themselves and their family and their loved ones. And like that has been turned into this massive crime.
No, it's completely ridiculous. And just, again, completely shameful deaths. Like
Yes.
that's it. To maximize deaths. Like, you don't want humanitarians to save people, then you want people to die.
Wow. It's just a wild reality. Well, either way, we'll continue to follow it. and continue to look at it and follow this trial and this story. I mean, this is unbelievable, as you heard, some of the charges against them. But why don't we just get ready to turn the page? Really, there's no good segue from a terrible story like that. But we want to turn to another critically important story with very serious implications all around the globe, certainly, but absolutely for the African continent. That is the issue of debt, and certainly the issues that arise from that, especially debt cancellation and other policies that can address some of these issues. And as we turn to that story, we are very happy to be joined by Tim Jones, who's the head of policy at Debt Justice in the United Kingdom. Mr. Jones, thank you so much for being with us.
Hey, it's great to be with you.
Well, great to have you here. And Financial Times this morning actually had a article that put out into the world a lot of what you all have been saying quite a bit in terms of who really holds Africa's debt, where is the vast majority of debt held. So I don't want to bury the lead here, but if you could just talk to us a little bit about the research you all have been able to do into this question of the debt crisis in Africa and who is really holding the majority of this debt and what that says about the overall contours of the question.
Yes, so the biggest problem debt for many countries is that owed to private lenders. These are things like big banks, asset managers like BlackRock, hedge funds, who both are owed a lot of debt. So with the highest interest debt, they've tended to charge interest rates of between 7 and 10% of governments at a time when countries like the US or the UK have to borrow at less than 1%. So this has created a huge debt burden for countries that they've been struggling to pay. And then over the last few years, the impact of the pandemic and now the rise in food and energy prices across the world has really hit countries hard. And so many, when they should be using scarce resources to help their people, are having to spend large amounts in debt, these kinds of lenders.
It's actually really incredible because we're just flooded with this propaganda, especially as things heat up between the US and China, about how it's China that's putting all of these African countries in these debt traps, and China is so predatory. But of course, this report shows that it's actually, I'm just going to read straight from it, just 12% of African governments' external debt is owed to Chinese lenders, compared to 35% owed to Western private lenders, which you just basically described. And more importantly, the Western lenders are charging double the interest as those as China. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, China did actually forgive several interest-free loans, I believe, recently. But my question here is, how is it possible that we're hearing that these Western countries, particularly the U.S., which has a huge stranglehold over organizations like the IMF, and then obviously the lenders that you just mentioned, like BlackRock, how is it that they can get away with making this argument when the facts just suggest the complete opposite?
Yes, it's not to say there isn't an important lender. 12% is still a reasonable amount, and in some countries it's others it's less. But as you say, there has been propaganda from Western governments that have wanted to pin all the blame for the debt crisis on lenders they have no responsibility for, China, and ignore the lenders that they do have responsibility for, the Western banks, Western companies, and also the Western-controlled institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which themselves and the World Bank are also one of the big lenders. And then that has also been lapped up by many media organizations that just love to play into this geopolitical battle. And it's just extremely outrageous that this issue that's so important of the huge debt payments that countries are facing and the need to tackle that has become another geopolitical battle between the West and China, rather than everyone coming to it with goodwill and saying, how do we resolve this for the best?
I think that's such a good point because it feels like, in a way, I almost am like flashing back to, 2008 and the bank bailouts. And they were like, well, those of us crying in the wilderness saying, don't bail out these banks. And, the discourse around moral hazard. And then they bail out the banks anyway, too big to fail, all these other things. And it just seems that there's a similar conversation now where it's almost just like, well, these profligate Africans, they borrowed all this money. They shouldn't have borrowed the money. It's unfortunate they can't pay it back. And I was hoping you could just talk about that framing because I feel like we never really get to the key issues, some of which you already outlined, which is, how do we actually help people in these countries? It just always seems like such a moralizing discourse about Africa and that anything that's done to address debt should somehow be punishing them in some way, for their profligate so-called activities.
Yeah. The narrative, and this we see in all kinds of debt, is that when debt is a problem, all the focus is put on the debtor and on the lenders. And it takes two to tango. And the lenders are as responsible for creating debt problems as any borrower. But also you've got to unpack who the borrower is. The governments that are signing the loan, and often very cash constrained governments that have huge pressures on them that therefore just have to rely on borrowing, but also not necessarily the citizens of that country having control over that process, but they're the ones who have to deal with the consequences of the debt. So it's both a lot more complex, but also just a lot more simple in thinking about the power dynamics that the lenders are driven by this. They're seeking to make money on the side of the private lenders, or they're seeking to forward certain geopolitical goals in terms of government lenders and international institutions. But then when problems arise, they just want all the focus to go on who is to blame is the governments, and to dissolve themselves of responsibility. And so we think it's our job as campaigners on debt, so Debt Justice in the UK, campaigners we work with around the world, to put a focus on the lenders and on the structural reasons why debt has become a problem. Why are countries so dependent on borrowing in the first place? What are the roots of that in colonialism, in racism, that we need to challenge too?
Yeah, it was quite striking to see in this report that even the IMF and World Bank are basically calling on governments like in the US and the UK to basically step in to stop these private lenders from blocking debt relief. And it's not, it's not usual, it's not typical that you'll see the IMF and World Bank make such calls like that a state should step in to regulate private industry in any way whatsoever. It's usually the opposite that they'll be calling for. So that's quite striking. But this speaks to a broader issue. I mean, there have been calls from various organizations in the past to just forgive the debt, for just basic debt relief altogether. I mean, is there a broader call for this? Is there any momentum for this, for debts to these countries? And you talk about some of the root causes of this. I mean, some of these countries are just in perpetual debt from the 70s and 80s. It's just never stopped since then, since post-colonialism. But is there any momentum towards that for calling for just get rid of the debt altogether?
We're trying to create that momentum in calling for the cancellation of debt, and there are many groups around the world that are doing the same. But then it's also useful to see the context where that is kind of being negotiated happening right now. It's not just an abstract concept. So Zambia at the moment is trying to negotiate a large amount of its debt being cancelled from some of the private lenders and from China. Ghana has just launched the same. And actually, while we as allies in the global north and as the campaigners in the global south are trying to push for that and support that cancellation, also governments do have some power in this process as well. So both Zambia and Ghana have stopped paying the private lenders, have stopped paying China. And this is really, that's useful and powerful. And we need to stand in solidarity with that and say, this is a good thing that they've stopped paying. And that means they can now use that money to help support their people and their economies. And if the private lenders refuse to cancel the debt, then they should just keep not paying them. And so it's not that debt cancellation has to be this thing that is granted from the powerful somewhere in the world. It's also something that we can try and create the space for debtors to do themselves, to stop paying and support them in that. Now, there's many things that could be done to help, and one of the key things, and that you alluded to with the calls by the IMF and the World Bank, is that these debt contracts are all governed either by law in New York or law in the UK. And one of the things that we could do specifically in New York and the UK is to change the law to make it easier for governments to get their debts cancelled from private lenders. And that's something actually the IMF and World Bank have hinted that they support. They've said it sometimes, and we've got clear proposals about how that could be done.
I think that's such an important point. It does speak to, one other element of how we move forward here is to what extent do we also need to change the framework of support that comes to these countries? I mean, I remember, when we had the Paris Club issue and the highly indebted poor countries debt relief. And then next thing you know, you've got all these countries, even more in hock to these banks. And it just feels like there's also a discourse and a conversation here about the responsibility of countries in the global north that have created this underdevelopment to also start offering more support that isn't just loans or money that has to be paid back, that there's sort of a repertory element to this as well.
Yes, so we definitely need to see reparations in a monetary form, but we also need to see them in a way that the system is changed. So cancelling debt by itself kind of can help in the immediacy and in dealing with the crisis. But if other things don't change, we'll just end up back in the same crisis again and again. So those changes that we need to see include changing the trade system so that it's fairer, there are fairer trade processes, tackling the climate crisis and emergency, regulating the financial system to stop there being such large flows of money around the world and boom and bust. So there's huge structural changes that are needed as well as there is a financial responsibility for grants to be paid from the wealthier countries to help those in the global south.
And for those who are watching, I mean, what can people do to, help in this attempt to try to move towards some sort of debt cancellation, debt forgiveness?
Yeah, so there are groups around the world that are part of our global movement to debt and change the system. So in the UK, we've got Debt Justice. So you go to our website, debtjustice.org.uk. In the US, there are some of our international allies like Oxfam, but there's also Jubilee USA, who you can contact, and they work across the US. There's also specifically in New York Communities for Change have been working on the need for legislation in New York. And if there's listeners in other countries around the world, there's various groups that you can get involved in.
Well, Tim, we really appreciate you joining us. Very illuminating report on Africa. Really appreciate all the work that you are doing and for you giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Great to be with you.
Well, Rania, I mean, it just, unbelievable issue on so many levels. I mean, just, metaphorical shackles perhaps, but I mean, you really can see how the whole game is rigged to keep the poor poor and the rich rich regardless. Maybe that's been the theme of what we've talked about so far, from the refugee crisis to the debt crisis. None of these things are happening randomly or in a vacuum.
No, they certainly are not. And there's people making like huge amounts of money off of this. I mean, like when we talk about private lenders and the level of the interest rates on loans like this. And then of course there's also like the capitalist class inside these countries that are, involved, because what do you always say about Africa? That Africa doesn't have a China problem.
It has a capitalist problem. Yeah.
Right. You have like capitalist elites inside of these countries that are just completely in bed, this comprador class, like totally in bed with these like international finance capital guys, and they're all making these deals together, and they're all profiting off of it together. And it does really it's structurally this way because it's just this huge part of this global system of, like you said, keeping the rich off of the backs of poor people in these countries that have no infrastructure, have, very little basic services that they were forced to get rid of back in the day under structural adjustment programs. And they're just in perpetual debt. And it really is sickening.
Yeah, it really is. Well, on that note, I think we can turn the page and move to our next topic, which is the ongoing oppression of the Palestinian people. Just terrible stories every day, it seems, unfortunately. More killed in the West Bank, earlier today for us. Very happy to be joined as we continue the show by Ali Abu-Nima, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada and the author of The Battle for Justice in Palestine. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene and Rania. It's always good to talk to you.
Well, it's always good to talk to you, and this is, coinciding here, our conversation with Mr. Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor of the United States of America, being in Israel. And I just, I was looking at some of the coverage earlier today, and they're, making it seem like the U.S. is going over there to talk tough to Netanyahu or something. But, we also had the issue with them saying they're going to continue to build the embassy in East Jerusalem. So maybe this is an obvious question. In some ways, the answer is obvious, Ali. But I mean, where are we with the Biden administration here on quote unquote U.S.-Israel policy?
Right. Well, Joe Biden made clear as soon as Netanyahu was elected in November that he reaffirmed that the U.S.-Israel relationship is unshakable, that the U.S. will stand by Israel, and they have done that. Where we see some U.S. discomfort, and when I say U.S., I mean more broadly than the Biden administration, but let's say the U.S. liberal elites, the New York Timeses, the NPRs, the Democratic Party, is discomfort with the, let's call it unwokeness of the new Israeli government, in the sense that this is a government that contains people who are openly homophobic, that want to curtail the independence of the judiciary, and other attacks on what are considered liberal rights for Israelis. So what they're concerned about is that it will get harder to market Israel as a democracy, and therefore to justify the unconditional U.S. support. None of this concern from Jake Sullivan has anything to do with the Palestinians. The Biden administration, the Democratic Party, the United States government as a whole is perfectly happy for Israel to keep killing Palestinians, as Israel is doing every day, and do nothing about it. It's today, January 19th. January 12th was the first anniversary of the Israeli army abducting, brutalizing, and killing Omar Assad, a 78-year-old Palestinian great-grandfather, in fact, a Palestinian American who had spent 40 years working his butt off, him and his wife, raising their family in Wisconsin and running grocery stores. And he went back home to the West Bank, built his dream house in his village, and then was beaten to death and left for dead by the Israeli army that's armed and funded by the U.S. A few months after that, Israel murdered in broad daylight on camera Shireen Abu Akleh, a Palestinian American, world-famous journalist. Nothing from the Biden administration, no accountability. That's the bottom line. That's it. You can still kill Palestinians and do it with total impunity. And Israel has done that literally every day, I think, since the start of this year. I'm not hearing the sound coming through from Rania.
I'm so sorry. I had my mute on. I apologize. We're having a tough day with technology, I'll tell you. But a power through. But no, Ali, to build off of what you're saying here, and you made a really good point about how a lot of this is really about trying to protect Israel's image, right? The problem is that these people who are in charge make Israel look really bad because some of them are openly fascist. And I encourage people to go watch the episode.
Which would be fine if they were in Ukraine, by the way. Sorry to interrupt.
Then it would be perfectly fine.
Just
no problem.
Context is everything.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good point. But I do encourage people to go watch the episode that I did with you recently on Dispatches, where we actually went through and talked about some of the figures, the really frightening figures in this government because of their open fascism. But another aspect that we'll see here before we get into maybe more of what's happening in the West Bank is what's happening in 48, really inside the Israeli Jewish community, right? There does seem to be this sort of, I don't want to call it a fight, I would call it more of an argument between the sort of right-wing religious zealots, the right-wing religious Zionists, and the sort of secular Zionists that want a pretty face on Israel. And you see that argument also mirrored inside the U.S. That's what the New York Times is upset about, right? That's what the Biden administration is upset about. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because we do, of course, see these anti-Netanyahu protests that Israeli Jews are participating in. So I'm just curious, having, you're observing what's taking place sort of within the Israeli Jewish Zionist camp and the argument taking place there. Is that significant? Does it matter? What's happening there?
Well, Israel is a settler colonial society, so that's an argument among settlers. There was there were differences, political differences between the whites in apartheid South Africa. During the final years of the apartheid regime, you had stiff competition among white supremacist parties, and some were more liberal white supremacists and others were more sort of hardline or traditional. I don't know how you classify white supremacists, but they were all white supremacists. And another analogy, I would say, of course, none of these are exact, but it's a little bit like, you could say that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party do have some differences in social policy. So, for example, on social rights, on abortion, on LGBTQ rights, you see some sharp differences among, mainstream Democrats and many Republicans. But when it comes to war, there's no difference. When it comes to the brutal policies at the U.S. border, there's no difference. When it comes to continuing to fund police forces that murder American citizens essentially just for being black, there's no difference. There's no substantial difference. Sometimes they talk slightly differently, but the policies don't really change. And that's how it is with Israel. Of course, everything there is sharpened by the fact that this is, of course, the U.S. is also a settler colonial society, but the sharpness of it in Israel is due to the intensity of the conflict with the Palestinians. But this is of no interest to Palestinians. You don't see any, and I think the emblematic thing was that at this big anti-Netanyahu protest in Tel Aviv the other day, some people showed up with Palestinian flags and they were promptly beaten by the protesters and sort of roughed up and pushed out. So this is sort of the equivalent of American liberals protesting against Donald Trump being a Russian agent. I mean, that's honestly the level I would put it on, because where were these people? Where were these tens or hundreds of thousands of Israelis when Israel was bombing Gaza and murdering Palestinians in their beds, or when Israeli snipers were being ordered to murder Palestinian children during the Great March of Return in 2018? there were maybe a couple of dozen Israelis who showed up in Tel Aviv, but not or hundreds of thousands. So it's important not to confuse any of this for any kind of fundamental challenge to the settler colonial privilege that all these people have. They just have a different vision of what that settler privilege should look like.
Well, talking about challenges to the settler colonialism, I think, of course, it's rightfully noted that many Palestinians are being brutally murdered all across the West Bank. But the other aspect of this, Ali, to me, is I think for the past, few years, it's felt like the center of gravity of the resistance was really in Gaza. But now it seems that there is perhaps the Palestinian struggle could always be described as irrepressible. But it does seem that, especially in Jenin, which of course has a long history, that there's a strong resurgence of a new generation of people who are just refusing to be silenced.
That's right. Now, a lot of the violence we see in the West Bank is the result of Israeli attacks on Palestinian communities, which are motivated by Israel's fear of this resurgent Palestinian armed resistance in the West Bank. Because 20 years ago, during the Second Intifada, Israel basically, with the help of the Palestinian Authority, crushed much of the armed resistance in the West Bank, pacified the West Bank, you could say. To not completely, but to a significant extent. And once Israel went in and brutally pacified, particularly Jenin and other places in the West Bank, but Jenin in particular was a center of armed resistance, the Palestinian Authority has been Israel's enforcer, making sure that there is no resurgence of armed resistance against Israel. So despite the rhetoric where Israeli leaders often attack Mahmoud Abbas, the reality is that they are very closely allied with Abbas, who they depend on. And what has been happening in the past year or two is this resurgence of a very capable armed resistance that doesn't seem to be tied to any of the traditional political factions. It seems to be independent of Fatah, of Hamas, of Islamic Jihad, and it is taking on the Israeli army in ways that Israel hasn't seen in a long time. And this is happening in a context where the Palestinian Authority is just simply on its way out. Mahmoud Abbas is in his 80s. He's and not in great health. He's extremely unpopular. He is a US/Israeli puppet or client, like so many others around the world. And when he goes, there is a great fear that the PA will simply collapse. And so Israel is trying to get ahead of this perspective by trying to preemptively take out this resistance. And I don't think they're going to be able to, but that is the driver of some of Israel's panic and its daily attacks on refugee camps, on cities like Jenin and Nablus, all over the place, in an attempt to try to crush this resistance, because Israel can no longer rely on the Palestinian Authority. And I expect with this new government, which is even more open, and it's not a quantitative, it's sort of a rhetorical difference. They will go out and actively seek violence, and so I think that the year ahead is going to be could be very, very difficult, in the sense that Palestinians are going to face even more violence from Israel and will be in a position where they'll have no option but to resist. Resistance for Palestinians is an existential necessity as well as being a right.
And Israel has a great deal to lose in a lot of this, especially given regional dynamics at the moment. I mean, in many ways, this really shows that despite Israel's incredibly complex system of, for years, very effective population control is like a nice way to put it. Despite all of that, despite the extensive surveillance systems that they have in place, the occupation they have in place, the walls they have in place, despite all of that, they haven't been able to pacify Palestinians. Maybe there was a brief period of time where the West Bank seemed pacified, but it's quite the opposite moving forward. And I guess I'm just curious, Ali, do you see this getting bloodier?
Yes, I do. I absolutely do. And I've been saying that for a while because there is no prospect for Israel. And remember now, the Palestinian people between the river and the sea. So when I say that, I mean in what is called Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza Strip, is the majority. They are the numerical majority. The ruling Jewish community is the minority. It may be a narrow minority, it sort of maybe 48% Jewish, really know exactly. But the point is that this isn't a situation of a majority oppressing 10% of the population. This is less than half the population trying to impose a supremacist regime on the majority. And that is not sustainable in the long run. There isn't a technology, there isn't a surveillance system, there isn't a wonder weapon, there isn't a propaganda strategy that can forever force a people to live in this subordinate system under a brutal regime of apartheid, occupation, and settler colonialism. All Israel has ever been able to do is to do what they call conflict management for periods of time, different tactics and strategies to try to buy time. But the confrontation is coming. And the only way out that can provide people with a decent life, and when I say people, I mean everyone in the country, Palestinians, but Israeli Jews as well, is an end to the Jewish supremacist regime. You cannot have peace under white supremacist apartheid in South Africa. You cannot have peace under Jim Crow and segregation in the United States. And you cannot have peace under Zionism in Palestine. Zionism is the antithesis of peace, justice, and equality. It is a violent attack on the indigenous people. It is an attempt to erase them. It is a form of genocide because remember that this Netanyahu government that just came to power put in its basic guidelines, in other words, the coalition agreement that provides the platform for the government, that the Jewish people alone has the right to all the land in what they call the land of Israel. But what they mean by that is historic Palestine. So they deny the existence and rights of the Palestinian people. That's a genocidal view, that the Palestinians don't exist or shouldn't exist. And so, yes, this will get more bloody, unfortunately, but the Palestinians are in a situation where the Palestinians haven't chosen violence. Israel has chosen the violence. The settler colonial regime is inherently violent, and Palestinians are finding that they have no choice but to defend themselves. That's always been the case, but it's not, unfortunately, that dynamic is not going to lessen in the immediate future. The end game is there has to be an end to the Zionist regime of settler colonialism and racism, and some kind of liberatory regime and decolonization. That shouldn't be controversial. That's the reality, but it's something we're still in deep denial about in the United States, in the mainstream. And I think what we're seeing now is this panic over the loss of the last vestiges of the liberal fig leaf that Israel has been able to maintain for a while. And people are starting to see Israel as Palestinians have always seen it. The face of Israel that people are suddenly waking up to and saying, my goodness, these people are crazy, these people are fascist, these people are extremists, is the face Palestinians have never been able to escape. And Israel is doing it because they've seen there's no consequences to it. The weapons will keep flowing, the money will keep flowing from the US and the EU. So the final point I'll make on this is to remember that the fate of the Palestinian people, or the oppression of the Palestinian people, is intricately tied to US imperialism. Where goes the US empire, Israel goes with it. The decline of the US empire is necessary for the liberation of the Palestinian people and people across the region.
Mm-hmm. Well, as always, Ali, we really appreciate you making time for us, and we couldn't recommend the Electronic Intifada more highly. Hopefully everyone has it in their daily media diet. But of course, thanks again for joining us here on the Freedom Side.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Real quick, Ron, you just want to shout out Martine Hernandez for your donation, an amazing run of donations. I don't know if there's anyone more loyal than you. Shout out to you, as always.
Seriously.
We should just add a little segment at the end just to shout Martine Hernandez.
Just for Martine Hernandez, yeah.
Be like Martine.
Love the loyalty, man.
Also, Josh Gilbert threw one in. Appreciate that. Before this show started today, too, someone became a patron at the $100 level, $100 a month. So whoever you are, if you're out there watching this show, thank you. I actually know exactly who you are. So if you are watching this show, thank you so much. It definitely made our afternoon here when we saw that one come through. And don't forget, you too can do the same at patreon.com/breakthrough-news.
And
but
a reminder,
yes,
before you go to our next guest, a reminder that if we can get 100 new patrons in the next month, can we get somebody on that? Can somebody count? We need a counter. We got to get somebody at BT to be in charge. 100 new patrons equals Eugene on Instagram, you guys. We got to get Eugene on Instagram.
It's never going to happen. Unless I guess we get 100 new patrons, but I just don't believe anyone cares that much about me being on Instagram. But prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. I would love to be wrong about this. I'll tell you that.
I'm going to become a patron. I'm going to become a patron of our program, just so you'll go on Instagram.
Thank you. Well, we're going to turn the page to our next topic, which is at base really about workers fighting for their rights, fighting for fair wages, the right to really be able to sustain themselves and their loved ones. And as we continue the conversation, we're very honored to be joined by Teo Reyes, who is the Chief Program Officer at the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, or ROC United. Teo, thanks so much for being with us here on the Freedom Side.
Pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much.
No, of course. Really happy to have you, and I think some people have probably seen what I felt was a bombshell article in the New York Times earlier this week. The other NRA, essentially stealing money from workers by giving them these classes in order to then lobby against workers' interests to raise the tip minimum wage. So maybe before we get into the specifics of this story and some of the other NRA, I think there's still some people who don't fully understand the tip minimum wage issue, are actually unaware that there's a huge classification of workers that are paid below the minimum wage. So if you could just give maybe a capsule framing of workers who are heavily affected by these minimum wage issues.
Well, it's the minimum wage in the country is still at the federal level. It's $7.25 an hour, right? And there's close to 20 states that still apply the $7.25 minimum wage, and then a subset of those, I believe 16 or 17 states, have a sub-minimum wage that's only $2.13 an hour, which means that if you receive tips, if you're in an officially tipped occupation, your employer only pays you $2.13 an hour, and your actual wage is paid by the customer. So it's actually the customer that's employing the services directly of someone's labor, and people don't realize that when they're tipping, you're actually paying that individual's wage. But it varies by state. some states have higher minimum wage, and we're part of this effort around the country to eliminate the subminimum wage so that all workers get a basic minimum wage, and any tips are a supplement to that basic wage. And the National Restaurant Association has been the primary opponent of raising the subminimum wage and raising the minimum wage, but they will use the subminimum wage as a tool to try to keep wages low overall. In the last time the minimum wage increased was in 92, right? The last time that there was a law passed to increase the subminimum wage, and what the NRA did is they negotiated with the administration, the Clinton administration at the time, to say, okay, we won't oppose the increase to the minimum wage, bringing it up from $4.50 to $7.25, as long as you keep from $4.25 to $7.25, as long as you keep the subminimum wage frozen at $2.13 an hour. So it stayed at $2.13 an hour, and it's never increased since then. And so that's, it's a major problem around the country. At the state level, whenever there's an effort to increase the minimum wage, the National Restaurant Association is one of the primary opponents, and they receive a lot of obeisance, you could say. Basically, a lot of legislatures and city councils bend over backwards to follow through with what the NRA lobbyists want. It's a major problem that we've been dealing with for decades now.
And then, it's amazing to me too that this is an NRA, if you will, that I've personally never heard of. And I've actually been a server. I mean, I actually know so many people who have been servers before. So many people at some point in their, before they, when they're in school or when they're in college or even afterwards. I mean, some people have it as a second job. Some people, it's actually their profession. Regardless, I feel like almost everyone I know has at some point in their lives been a server and had to deal with their wages basically coming from customers, although we don't see it in the US like that. So it's just so amazing that this organization, this lobbying group, has so much power and nobody's ever heard of it. But what's even more interesting is, of course, you have these training courses that restaurant workers are supposed to take. And these training courses that they have to pay to take, I don't know if it's them who have to pay for it or who they're working for pays for it, but then that money ends up going into lobbying against raising their wages. Can you talk a bit about that? Because I mean, that's an even more insidious aspect of this, is that workers are unknowingly funding their own poverty, their own poverty wages in a way.
It is a pretty insidious system. So essentially, every state requires that at least one individual at any restaurant be certified as a food safety certified in food safety handling, food handling safety. But there are some states that require everybody in an establishment to have that certification. One of the most popular and well-known certification programs is called ServSafe, and that is owned by the National Restaurant Association. And so it's the default. And so employers, will send their staff to go get that food handling card. Will have public health departments telling workers to go to ServSafe to get that food handling card. And so you have this whole system of incentives where you have both employers and government entities really telling workers, go here, get your food handling card. In some cases, you pay $10, some cases up to $27, $28, and then that's a requirement to go to work. And that money then gets shifted to the lobbying program at the NRA to essentially work against their interests. There's one particular example which is really really highlights this. In Allegheny County, the health department was a member of the state affiliate of the National Restaurant Association. So the health department for the county was sending money to the NRA. I believe they still are. At the same time that Pennsylvania Lodging and Restaurant Association was lobbying the county to prevent any law that would increase sick days for individuals who are sick at work, right? So they're using the money to make sure that no laws pass that would increase protections for both employers and customers and make sure people are healthier, and it's being supplemented, it's being paid through the county health department. So it's a really insidious system. It's tied to the fact that They are seen in many cases as a very benign entity. Most people have very positive feelings towards the restaurants. I do as well. The restaurant I go to, I know the people who work there, I know the owners, and so my immediate feeling is going to be, this is great, right? And legislators that don't know will think, okay, these are people that I know, I respect. I will do fundraisers there. So when they come and talk to me about this, I really listen to them. But then that relationship deepens. They start to receive more and more funding support from the National Restaurant Association. You'll see a greater number of fundraisers held at some key restaurant locations. And then that influence just grows. And it's really an influence at every level of government, at city, like I mentioned, at city council, at the state legislature, and at the federal level as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I'm glad we got it in there in D.C., but I was there for that initiative, 71, I guess it was, maybe 77. That was unbelievable to see how overwhelmingly the city said, let's do this. And they said, oh, it's just a recommendation. I mean, that's when I learned about the other NRA, and man, they put some muscle in. But, one question I have, Teo, that I think is, I always wonder this. Why do we tip? I mean, I've been lucky enough to go around the world, and been very, privileged to do so. And there are obviously some countries where, you don't tip because people are paid at least the approximation of a living wage. So I always wonder, how did we even get to this kind of system whereby you would say, here's a job that will demonstrably not pay you enough money to survive?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a couple of ways to look at that. One is, what's the historical root of tipping, and that is a really problematic history. And the other is, what is the role of the tipping system now, and what do we do about it? And I think that's a lot more complicated. I mean, historically, tipping comes out of emancipation. You have a large pool of free black labor. And employers don't want to pay them wages, and so that when they go into the service industry, basically they're paid through tips only, and it's again the customers who are paying these individuals directly. The best known example, of course, is the Pullman porters who were working on trains, who were living off of tips, not really getting a wage, and very famously fought for a union that instituted wages for workers, servers in the railroad, hospitality workers really that were on the railroads. When the Fair Labor Standards Act passed during the Depression, it excluded businesses that were not involved in interstate commerce, and under that definition, that included all service entities as well. So they were not required to pay any minimum wage. Restaurants were not, gas stations were not, retail establishments were not required to pay any type of minimum wage. Once that was amended in the 60s, that was the first time that there was actually any type of wage at all for tipped workers. And it was set at about 50%, sometimes 60% of the minimum wage. And then it got frozen, as I mentioned, the last time the minimum wage increased. So that's the history of it. So there's an insidious history attached to it. But when you look at it today, it becomes much more complicated because people who work in the industry are very emotionally attached to the tipping system. It's when you get a really big tip, it's like you won the lottery, and it's a really huge incentive, right? And so people are really emotionally attached to it. We don't advocate to eliminate the tipping system. We advocate to make sure that there is a solid wage for those days when people don't get tipped. And then tipping can serve to really help people move into thriving wage jobs, into higher wage jobs, to really be able to raise a family. And you see that around the country. So there's 7 states that don't have a sub-minimum wage, and now District of Columbia and Michigan is poised to eliminate its sub-minimum wage as well. And in those states, which it's certainly it's California, or Oregon, Washington, the ones that are known as being more progressive, perhaps, but it also includes Alaska, Montana, Nevada, and Minnesota. In those states, there is no sub-minimum wage. Everyone gets paid a full wage, and people still tip there. It's a custom in this country to tip. And so what that means is that there's lower rates of poverty among servers, among tipped workers in those states. And what's really interesting, is that the difference, the percentage of workers of color in poverty who are tipped workers is much lower. It's like cut in half or more in those states. So it really helps to increase opportunities, economic opportunities, getting rid of that subminimum wage, raising wages for everybody really helps to eliminate some of those disparities we see that are tied to race and gender in this country.
Yeah. I mean, that history lesson you just gave explains a lot. I mean, it really is a uniquely American thing. The whole having this like poverty wage, and then having this really large amount that people, are supposed to tip in order to make up for the fact that the wages are so low. Because you don't see that abroad. I mean, if you ever go to any European country, for example, and you tip even like 5%, people act like you just like saved their children from like a burning building or something, because it's just like not a common thing to do, because people make a decent wage as servers. And that goes for countries in the global south as well. It's actually not common to be tipping 15 to 20% like it is in the US. I'm sorry, you want to say something? I can see.
No, and I think that's what's really complicated, because we have this system here where tipping seems to play a role in, when you eliminate the subminimum wage, it seems to play a role in helping lift people out of poverty into higher wages, because they have that higher base wage, right? They can depend on that now $15 an hour in most of these states, right? But you go abroad, and there's all of a sudden, because you have Americans traveling abroad quite a bit, this growing, like if you go abroad and want to follow local tipping customs, and they know you're American, they might resent you for that, right? Because they know, well, all the Americans tip me a lot, right? But at the same time, you don't want to create a system that encourages them to get paid less either, right? If they have a system that sets a living wage for everybody, that really professionalizes that labor, you don't want to play a role in undermining that. So I think it's really complicated.
Yeah,
it's
difficult. Of course.
Well, for me, it's not that complicated, because I feel like if you're serving me my food, I want you to get paid whatever you want to get paid. You're serving me my food, you're flying my plane. Like, look, whatever you need, that's what I want you to have. Because look, you got to take care home. But I think it raises another, I think, important question about the way a lot of times these debates play out in the legislative arena. And it's maybe not a full appreciation of, the stratification also of the restaurant industry. I mean, I remember, when we had the failed attempt in DC, that was a lot of the discussion is, they were finding people who, great people. I'm not trying to, rip them as people, but, you're a bartender at the Palm. So you're making, a huge amount of money, because this is serving like the richest people on earth. So that's, is what it is. But then if you're at IHOP or Denny's or Waffle House, you're in a very different situation there. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that too, because I think that's something that often gets lost, because there's always this attempt to find sort of the exceptions of people who are doing really well and say, if we change anything, they'll stop doing well.
Well, one thing that they have been very successful at, what the National Restaurant Association has been very successful at, is scaring workers into thinking that if you raise the wage, that everyone's going to stop tipping and you're going to lose a lot of money. And that's just not true. It's just not the case. But they've been really successful at scaring workers. You had a lot of workers in DC who went to city council. I was there for that, right? Who came in and really spoke against raising the wage, because they were told, oh, you're going to lose all your tips. I mean, it's not rational, because no one goes into a restaurant tipping knowing what that individual earns per hour, right? It's just not, there's that relation. Most people don't have that information available. So tipping it's just it's a customary practice in this country. And you have the industry actually I was in Orlando several years ago, and they were trying to push people to tip 30%. And I think that was part of their efforts to keep wages low, right? We need people to earn more to come into work, but we don't want to pay them more. So let's push the customer to try to tip more as well, right? But it's a major issue. The industry, will hire these firms to set up these AstroTurf organizations to really put up Facebook groups and try to agitate them against their best interest. And that's a thing that was very successful in Maine. It was very successful in DC, somewhat so in New York. In DC, you basically had a ballot initiative that was passed several years ago, overturned by the city council, and then recently passed again. And the city council said they're going to abide by the will of the voters, and that's going to be to the long-term best interest. But there's a lot of workers who oppose that even now. But that changed a bit. The pandemic really changed people's opinion about what it means to be a tipped worker, because there's a lot of places where people were working and they were not getting tipped, and they were getting abused by customers, they were getting abused by management. So that really changed people's perspective on that as well. But that's it is. From what we've seen, because every state that has raised their wage, even where they've raised the subminimum wage, you do not see an impact on employment in the industry. You just don't. Employment continues to grow in those states. There isn't this relationship. If anything, there's an inverse relationship in which when you raise the minimum wage, more people go out to eat, more people go, spend money at the bar, etc., and actually employment increases. It's not a huge increase, but there's not any decline. The industry would like to tell you, oh, if we have to raise wages, it's going to destroy us all. Everyone's going to close. That's just not true. It hasn't happened anywhere. Everywhere the minimum wage has increased, the industry has continued to grow, and employment has continued to grow as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me ask you this before we let you go. Where can people find ROC United and the work you do? I know you guys are working with workers, you're working with the community, fair-minded employers, and others.
Yeah. So ROCUnited.org. We're on Twitter, ROC United. We have a TikTok page, Instagram. Please come visit. One of the things that we're really trying to build support for is the Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights, which is an effort that would really move us towards thriving wages for workers. That means more than living wage. It means that your needs are met and you can actually thrive on top of that. The way that includes things such as access to childcare, access to healthcare. So we're really looking at this holistically and trying to change the industry so that it's lifting up wages and conditions for everybody instead of what it's historically been, which has been a drag on that. So I encourage people to come and support the Restaurant Worker Bill of Rights, but come check us out at ROCUnited.org. Thank you.
Right on. Teo Reyes, Chief Program Officer at the Restaurant Opportunity Center United, ROC United. Thanks so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much. It's been great.
Well, Rania, crucially important issue, critically important issue. I think the last point he made there's no negative impacts on employment. Listen, California is one of these states. Newsflash, restaurants are not closing left and right in San Francisco and LA because people's wages went up. And in fact, prior to the pandemic, the opposite was the truth. These are some of the hottest restaurant cities in America, Seattle, different places like that. So, I definitely would encourage people to track this issue in your states. And some of you may be in this situation, and a lot of workers around the country have totally shifted the narrative, by organizing with groups like ROC and others and pushing back.
Yeah, and once again, it's always the same argument whenever it comes to raising wages anywhere. It's going to make everybody go out of business, or it's going to make the product too expensive and nobody's going to be able to afford it. And it just case after case demonstrates that is completely inaccurate and
totally
just
fake.
A propaganda. Yeah, literally just made up.
You can go to the Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, which is a government agency. They actually measure profits that are made by corporations in the United States on every quarter and on a yearly basis. I actually won't tell you any of the numbers. I'll let you go do the research on yourself. But when you look at it, what you will see is there is no world where corporations are not making huge sums of money. And there's this massive conspiracy that makes you think every business is on the verge of closing. And if you raise the minimum wage, if you raise the taxes or blah, 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 that the whole world is going to collapse. It's not true. And if you want to get even deeper, check out something called the State of Income Report by the IRS. And that'll tell you in your state the amount of taxable income based on every quintile of income, right? So a fifth of income. So you will be able to see exactly what the richest people in your state, how much money they have that is taxable and how much money they pay in taxes. And newsflash, what you will see when you do that research is they could pay a lot more taxes and their lives wouldn't change at all. So the numbers are there. They are widely available for free from the U.S. government to prove that anyone who says raising the minimum wage or raising taxes is bad for the economy is a liar.
I saw this.
Rania? Nope. Go ahead.
I was going to say something about Instagram.
Well, since we're wrapping up the show and talking about how individuals can support the show, why don't you tell them how they can support the show and what you would like to say about Instagram?
Well, I was gonna make a segue to talk about Instagram from what you were saying, and I'm still gonna say it. It's that I was scrolling through Instagram earlier and I saw a Vice Instagram post. It said something like, if you taxed billionaires like 5%, we could eliminate like hunger among 2 billion people or something. And I'm just like, man, 5% is nothing. We should be taxing them like 100%.
1950s, the top income rate was 90%. I mean,
yeah.
But if you think about if you're making, $1 billion or whatever, and the thing that people have to realize, a lot of this money is never taxed.
$100 million. You still have $100 million. And of course, there's all kinds of loopholes for you to hide half that money anyway.
No, and now they all hide it in assets. They don't have to tax it. So, I mean, we also have to look at asset taxes because, it's ridiculous. Most people don't even really know this. The Elon Musk, these rich people like that, what they do is they actually borrow money from banks to avoid paying taxes. So let's say you see Elon Musk, I'm just using him as an example, his wealth goes up $5 billion. So rather than try to liquidate $5 billion, which would mean he'd have to pay taxes, although capital gains, which is lower than income taxes. But anyway, rather than do that, Elon Musk will go to, say, Bank of America and say, why don't you loan me $2 billion, and then he'll cash out just enough money to pay the interest on the loans so that essentially you don't have to pay any taxes on the billions of dollars in wealth you have. So it's an amazing shell game that is being played by the richest people and the biggest banks to hide the true amount of money that they have and to basically make sure that none of it is ever subject to taxation.
Meanwhile, people are being forced to report $600 on Venmo or something by the IRS.
Well, and it's interesting because the Republicans are actually lying about what's going on with the IRS. And they're basically saying, they're only bringing in these new IRS agents because they want to go after people with small amounts of money. And undoubtedly, if they have more IRS agents, they will go after more people in general. But the area that's been the most hollowed out in the IRS is actually complex tax returns of people making over $5 million because they have a lot of ability to evade taxes with all of their tax lawyers. And so that actually is the subset of people who are most likely to be targeted when the IRS starts to build out its bureaucracy again. But since Republicans and some Democrats represent the people who are, not paying taxes, they are certainly trying to create this fear-mongering about, the IRS coming after people for small amounts of money. Now, that being said, obviously, there will be more overall tax compliance if there are more overall compliance officers. But realistically, the people who are truly being hurt by the starving of the IRS is you and I, the average everyday person who, the IRS will come after because it's very simple. If we mess up our taxes, they can see it right away.
We don't have we don't have 100 tax lawyers getting us out legally through all the loopholes that exist. And also, people who end up getting targeted the most with fewer fewer enforcement mechanisms end up being easy targets who made a mistake and maybe some tax credit they accidentally claimed, or people who claim a child tax credit and then are forced to prove it in bizarre, strange ways. And then they actually don't even end up getting their tax credit till years later because of how long it takes for them to put together the paperwork to prove. I mean, it's really absurd, the system that we have right now. But I forgot the reason I raised all this, Eugene.
Please.
You're trying to distract me. You're trying to distract me. I raised this as a segue to Instagram because I saw that Vice post on Instagram. And I wanted to bring it back to Instagram because I want to remind our viewers that we now have a campaign at Breakthrough News, which again, we need to put someone in charge of following where the count started today. If we can get 100 new patrons, in the next month, so by February 19th, then that means Eugene will join Instagram. Okay? So let's get on it.
Yes, let's do that. And if you so choose, you can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. And there you can become a patron and I guess contribute to the Instagram fund, we can call it now, or just
Eugene
do
joins
it
Instagram.
because you really support Breakthrough News in all of its ways. Either way, whatever your reasoning, we deeply appreciate all of your patronage, all of our patrons, all of our one-time donors, two-time donors, donors in the chat, donors on PayPal, however you do it. We are deeply, deeply appreciative. You make it possible for us to be here.
Before you sign off, I want to read Martin Hernandez responded
In the chat, yes.
In the chat about being a retired social worker, living on a pension, and home voting with my dollars for socialism and liberation. That is so beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
Seriously, we really appreciate you. We really, really appreciate you. It's to have consistent support. It really means a lot to us, and we appreciate the message. We appreciate the donations. And I always say, social work, very good profession, very conscientious people. On that note, Rania, we will end the show here for today. As always, it's my pleasure to be here alongside with you. And for myself and Rania Khalek here on the Freedom Side on Breakthrough News, we will see you next week.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
We did it, Joe.